In the words of the king of Hollywood himself, I need you to trust me one last time as we review Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning right here, right now on Spoiler Alert. Welcome back to Spoiler Alert. I am your host, Sheldon, here with Evan, and we are ready to dig into my most anticipated movie of the year in Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. But as you all know, and as you know, Evan, we have to review another movie before that because Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is a unique bird where it is a two-part story.
Well, originally it was called Dead Reckoning Part 1 and Dead Reckoning Part 2.
Originally. And then things didn't work out in that department.
Right, and then they changed it to the title, just having its own name.
It's been kind of a wild story, and that's honestly where we should start. The production of these two movies, of Dead Reckoning, formerly Part 1, and Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, has been a long, 6-year journey for these filmmakers, because it really all started in 2019 when they started to prep for what they announced would be Mission Impossible 7 and 8, which originally was supposed to be released in 21 and 22.
Oh, I think they wanted to do it back to back.
And so they started a location scouting. They started shooting, or started prepping to shoot in February 2020 in Venice. And we all know what happened in March 2020 when the entire world shut down. Yep. And that included the production of Mission Impossible. And so throughout 2020, they shot a lot of Dead Reckoning, and then 2021. And obviously with big movies like this, there's always reshoots. There's always going back to do pickup shots. There's extended visual effects. There's all sorts of things you got to accommodate. And so they ended up pushing back the release date from the original 21 and 22 release dates to 22 and 23, and then 23 and 24, and then finally they
23 and 25.
They finally moved Final Reckoning to 25. So this movie, this two-parter, really started off exactly that, as a two-parter. They were going to shoot it back to back. They were going to release them back to back years, and it was going to be a Part 1, Part 2, which it still is, but they just kind of dropped that title, I think, more for the purpose of bringing in a more general audience.
I was going to say more for a marketing aspect of saying the final, right? People are more attracted to the end of the story than the beginning. But yeah, anyway.
Exactly. So with that said, let's dive into the next phase of our Mission Impossible review, because we've been waiting for this all year. I know I have. It's been
waiting for it a long time.
It's been part of my life for a long time now, and I'm finally excited to talk about it. But let's start with taking us back to 2023, July of 2023, when we beheld the movie that was Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning.
It was a great summer. We had Barbenheimer, which I was crazy excited for.
We insane.
Got this. What else did we
The funny thing about that is
2023.
Barbenheimer did have a big effect on this movie, I think, because
we also got Across the Spider-Verse in that same year.
We also had Dune. Dune was 24 in March. We had Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, so there's that. But let's not remember that. Let's not even go there. Yeah. We don't want to go there.
Thank you.
Now the funny thing, actually, though, with Dead Reckoning, is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning have a very similar plot structure, similar ideas.
It's funny. We talked about this, how from beginning to end, arch nemesis, what they're after, the new characters, subplots. It's very, very similar.
It is a very similar story, right?
It's really about fun.
An aging hero who meets a villain from his past, who both these people are in search of two halves of something that can potentially destroy the world. They're both joined by this new brunette chick who comes along for the ride. They both have a knife fight on top of a train. Yep. They're both looking for something that's underwater. It's like there's very similar plot beats. I don't think that they're not copying each other. I mean, these movies were filmed at the same time.
But there's also a lot that's very similar that you kind of draw a little suspicion. That's really weird that these two movies are very similar in these categories.
So if you haven't seen Dead Reckoning yet, Dead Reckoning takes place a few years after Mission Impossible Fallout, and it follows Ethan and his team as they are trying to track down two halves of a key that is set to control a an AI, an artificial intelligence known as the entity. So that's what the movie is about. That's where it follows. And this movie is a long movie,
but it doesn't
feel that way,
which I love.
And it's got a whopping 2 hours and 43-minute runtime. But like most Mission Impossible movies, it breezes by for the most part. So let's just start there. So Evan, as we kick off talking about Dead Reckoning, what are the positives of Dead Reckoning? Why would you recommend people to go watch this? I mean, right now it's not in theaters anymore, but it's available streaming different places. But what are your biggest pros for this movie?
I mean, I would say it's one of the kind of classic Mission Impossible things as far as, right, the main scenes that we see in this movie, for them being on the train, them starting off getting the dude, I can't think of the city.
The opening city that they're in?
Yeah,
they start in Abu Dhabi. Well, the movie kind of jumps around a little bit, right, in the opening act, because they have the opening scene takes place somewhere in the Bering Sea on a Russian
and they're like,
submarine.
Hey, we don't know, right? We see the Sevastopol, and then the entity tricks the Sevastopol into sinking itself. And
which,
then it goes
by the way, that sequence is so good. I love that opening scene.
I also like, spoiler, how we learn, because at first we didn't really know, but we learned that accident happened like 5 to 10 years before the movie happened.
Right. So,
which they didn't really
like you said, spoiler alert.
Fun.
The sinking of the Sevastopol that opens up Dead Reckoning actually takes place in the winter of 2012, right? And so this movie actually takes place. I mean, it released in 23, but in Final Reckoning they reveal that the movie actually takes place in 2026, which is interesting. But the opening of the movie, you don't know when you watch it, but it's actually it happens.
It's in
many
the past,
years,
which is kind of fun. But also, I feel like that would have been interesting if they disclosed it a little bit. Anyway, long story short, right, that's how it starts. And then it goes into the director.
Right. They have this big old meeting with all these different
security briefing.
Different heads of state and different people in the government, where they talk about this entity, and then they
talk about what's going on.
You get a big exposition dump in this scene where they essentially tell you exactly that, okay, we're looking for 2 halves of a key that the Russians are after, that is said to be able to control
free thinking AI is leaving traces where we can be seen. It's literally just looking, it's not taking, blah blah blah, and then it starts to set it up until Ethan finally gets introduced.
Right.
As
right. He's given a mission to go and to find Ilsa Faust from the previous movies, because she is said to have 1/2 of the key. So he goes to somewhere in the Arabian desert, finds Ilsa, gets the key, or at least his half of the key, and then he comes and infiltrates the meeting where you have all these different heads of state.
Yep.
And that's where he says, you know what, I'm not going to give this to you. I'm going to destroy the entity. That's my goal. That's my goal.
And then Kittredge was like, what do you mean you're going to destroy it? Like,
and then we get, after 28 minutes into the movie, we get the opening credits, which I thought was really interesting, because
they really
I've never seen a movie that has the opening credits come this late in the movie.
I was gonna say,
but I mean, it makes sense where they put it, right? I think it works well where they put it, and it also cuts out a lot of the exposition, so it makes you feel like you're a lot later in the movie than you actually are.
That's fair,
but I think it works well, just the way that was edited.
Yep.
So, what would you say, Evan, are some of your favorite parts of this? What are your pros? What makes Dead Reckoning work for you?
I really like the kind of coming into light of this new AI villain, especially at the time, right? Like, let's rewind 2 years ago. 2.5 years ago, almost 3, right? When people and the world that we are in now is starting to now use AI for literal like work tools.
For
like
everything, really.
We literally were like, oh my gosh, we can use ChatGPT. Like, yes, these tools have been around for technically ages, but now they were kind of coming into public use. So I thought that it was really, really perfect timing for them to almost introduce this and make the world feel very related to it. To be like, almost not concerned, but
they
like,
presented it as like a real threat.
Yeah, which is kind of fun.
Everybody is familiar with. I mean, you have a 12-year-old kid who's familiar with AI, up to the oldest people that will go watch a movie like this. And so it's something that everybody can relate to because it's such a big part of society now.
It's so known.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a really good introduction for them to kind of create this master plan of, how the world's going to end and all this bad stuff, but using something that's very new and relatable that as the audience, we're like, this is new. This is relatable. And then we got to kind of see their view of how they view this entity in AI. And
I definitely really like the way they approached it because they made it, so they took, a classic spy movie and they brought something into it that was very new and felt fresh and like someone hadn't done before. Yep. Kind of in the same way that I think No Time to Die did a similar thing where they brought in this DNA targeted virus that can kill people through their DNA. And so I liked that because in both cases, whether it's James Bond or Mission Impossible, both enemies or both weapons felt like they were very pertinent to the movies they were in, but they were also fresh and it hadn't really been done before.
Yeah.
So I really liked that.
Yeah. I would say that that's my first main one. There's, of course, a lot of pros about this that we'll get into. Of course, right? Stunt work. Stunt work was amazing, but going in chronological order, one of my other favorites was how the airport scene was. What I mean by that is, right, we get our introduction to Grace, who I don't mind Haley Atwell. I think that she did okay.
I think she did really good, especially in this movie, because I think she does a good job of showing someone who's a very competent thief, but not someone who's a trained killer.
Yeah, and we see that a lot where she uses her, witty skills to get out of things, but then also there's at times that she's like really scared and like, I don't know what to do, and then backs off, right? Which I thought was a really good development for her character, because then it wasn't somebody who just came in who was just a complete badass who knew what she was doing.
Right, which I think is a big problem with a lot of movies like this. When they introduce a female character, they do that a lot, where it's like she's better than the hero. She knows more than the hero.
Right.
She does everything better.
And she's pretty, so then everybody's like, ooh.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that Haley Atwell's character shouldn't have been like as skilled as others, but I think for the character development,
her character fit exactly what they were going for.
Yeah.
And the way they introduce her in this movie pays off in Final Reckoning in the end, which we'll spoil later when we get to that.
I agree.
But it pays off in a big way. It shows you why she was needed as part of the team, which I really liked about Final Reckoning, which we'll get there when we get there.
But I thought the airport scene was really done well. It was your kind of classic misconception, trying to steal something. And then, of course, right, we get introduced to Gabriel. But it was kind of this still fun, really exciting sequence where we got a little bit of everything right off the bat, right? We got him running on the airport, the misconception of like the software mixing up who they were. The U.S. government guys were all in a loop. We got to meet Gabriel and really get that intense chasing, and then we get Grace.
There's
just
a lot
of intro of like, hey, this is how this movie's going to be looking with the bomb and Luther. And Benji,
there's a lot of
everything.
moving parts.
I thought that it was still a really good job for how in depth that just airport scene was before it then transitioned into him having to go to Paris,
Rome
to meet her.
But no, I do like that because there's so many moving parts in the airport sequence, and even that sequence itself is a pretty long one, but there's so much going on that you don't feel the runtime. Which, like I said, the pacing is incredible because it's a long movie, but it doesn't feel like that. And that also has to help because this movie is essentially 4 sequences.
Yep.
Like there's everything before the opening credits, but that's kind of like a freebie. That's a free pass.
That's almost like introduction.
Yeah.
Of like, hey, this is what's going on.
But then everything after the opening credits, there are four
it's the airport to Rome
to Venice to the train sequence. So that's it. That's the whole movie.
Yeah, and then they have to travel. And then it has a little bit of bits every now and then of like where somebody's at or what they're doing. But yeah.
But
they capitalize on 4 main scenes.
Yeah.
That's what I love.
They're just, it kind of goes back to the way they had the Dubai sequence in Ghost Protocol, is that it's just about having you're in one location, you have a mission, but then there's things that keep escalating that mission.
That changes how it works.
Yeah, it changes the dynamics of it. And that's what this movie's built on, is that it's constantly changing dynamics that make this movie be a lot longer than it feels like.
Well, especially in this, we get we really see after the Rome sequence of Ethan having to go rescue Grace, he catches up to Luther and Benji, and that was after Ilsa, wasn't it?
Before. So they
right
meet
before.
up.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you're right. Thank you. Because then they have to go to Venice to see the entity.
Right.
But I like how they, like just that sequence of them kind of coming in to now having to regroup. Luther has to be really honest, with her about things. And then they have to go and basically make sure that she's committed leading up until Ilsa's death. I think that whole scene, like, it doesn't feel very long, but like you were saying, just the way that they wrote the script and the pacing of it was just really well done.
Mm-hmm. And something I love about this movie is I think this movie has the best car chase scene in any Mission Impossible in Rome, when, just because, again, it's changing dynamics. So it's a car chase scene that starts off with Ethan chasing after Grace, and Ethan's on a bike, she's in a car, she crashes, he ends up having to get in with her and they drive a little bit further, then they handcuff each other, and so she ends up having to drive, but then they have to switch cars and he has to drive, but then the car topples and they end up getting switched spots, so she drives again. It's just the dynamics of it are constantly switching, and it makes for a really, really fun, engaging sequence.
Yeah.
And I think it's the best car chase in Mission Impossible.
I would say that the Rogue Nation one
Rogue Nation one is good. Yeah. I just think this one's better. I had more fun.
I like the Rogue Nation one more because I've watched some of the behind the scenes, which you've probably seen, and Simon Pegg was in the car with him. Yeah. And he was like, I don't know why, but I trusted, Tom enough. And
that's what I love about Mission Impossible as a whole, is because of how much practical action there is. Yes, there's a lot of CG. There's a lot of visual.
Well, yeah, they can't literally blow up an actual helicopter.
They always touch it up. But if you go and you watch these movies, you can see they are real actors doing these real stunts, and they're crazy.
Yeah, it's awesome,
and it pays off in the final movie. Another absolute win for this movie is the chase scene in Venice. Right, so they go to Venice and they're trying to buy the second half of the key from the White Widow returning from Mission Impossible Fallout. And you have Gabriel, who's acting on behalf of the entity, who essentially says that I've been promised the key as long as one of Ethan's women died tonight. So either Ilsa or Grace.
Yeah.
As long as one of them died tonight, then I've been promised the key. And so I like the build up to that scene, and then the ultimate Ethan running in desperation to save one of them.
Yeah, Grace or Ilsa, whoever it is.
And then ultimately, spoiler alert, Gabriel ends up killing Ilsa.
Sad.
And she's
sad.
She's out. She's dead.
Yeah.
Which a lot of fans hated at the time. Which I get. Ilsa's a good character, but I also felt it like it was.
I think it was good for the plot. I think it was still sad that somebody that close to him had to die.
But I think it worked, and it was and that everything about that chase scene is so good. The intensity of it, the lighting, the cinematography, the score is absolutely incredible. But I get why people didn't like that she died, but I think it was a very fitting end to her character as someone who sacrificed herself to save Grace. And then
I don't know, there's both sides to it. I don't mind that, but I understand its purpose. So
I think it just takes one step further in kind of talking about the overall theme of this movie, because at the beginning they introduced the idea of the IMF oath, which is we live and die in the shadows for those we hold close and for those we never meet. And in that case, I mean, Ilsa wasn't really part of the IMF.
But she kind of got brought on.
She still, I think her character stuck to that ideology, and therefore she did end up dying in the shadows, literally, for someone she'd never met.
Yeah.
And so I really like that, just that idea. And then, ultimately, again, this movie feels really fast because that's 3 sequences of the movie done. Then you only have one more.
Yeah, and
which is the final train sequence, which is a very long sequence, but it's because there's a lot of moving parts.
Well, there's more than some of the other scenes, I guess, but it's also there's a lot more that needs to happen. So they kind of have a little bit more that gets drug out a little bit,
right? Because ultimately, the purpose of this final sequence is they're trying to get the second half of the key from the White Widow, and then get off the train
and escape.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so, what are your favorite parts? I guess of that.
Of course, the stunt.
What are some pros?
The stunt was, of course, real, right?
Which, for those of you who don't know, the stunt.
The main thing that was advertised all over.
I think, too, part of it, that was part of actually a con because I think they over-advertised the stunt.
Yeah, and then you see it, and then you're like...
Right, because I feel like probably most everybody has seen the stunt. Even if you haven't seen it, would have been cool. Tom Cruise driving a bike off of the cliff.
It's the same with, the plane. I wish that they wouldn't have just used that as their, This is why
Rogue Nation?
No, with The Final Reckoning.
I don't think it was the same because there's a lot more you don't see in the Final Reckoning with the plane sequence.
But I think that they shouldn't have just... They focused so heavily on, that was a lot of the branding of it. And I feel like it would have been a lot more engaging if we got to then see that for the first time instead of kind of already seeing
but I get it because it's a big piece of bringing people to the movie theater is that
he was actually hanging off a plane.
Right, and they've been doing that for years. Really since, I think, probably Ghost Protocol is really when they started to market the movies as these crazy stunts with him hanging off the bridge.
Yeah. Anyway.
But the train sequence is very good. I do think one of the cons of it is that it is a little bit too long.
I agree.
There's a lot going on, but at times...
Maybe take away 5 minutes of just a little snippets of everything to kind of just shorten it.
I think you could. I think a part of the problem too is that for a lot of the train sequence, Ethan's not there, right? He's because he's on the run throughout the movie. He can't actually get on the train the same way everyone else can, so he has to find another way onto the train.
Yeah, it's a lot of the widow's dialogue, and then Gabriel, and everything, which it's necessary for the plot. So I get it, but yeah, and then of course, right then he gets there, he breaks in, flies in on his parachute, and then kind of that whole
and then we get sequence. Into right when Gabriel blows up the bridge, and the train kind of snakes off the track, which I really love that.
I think it was really creative, especially to see the set of them, how the train car's actually upside down and they were climbing on it like a rock wall. I thought was cool.
It was a very creative idea of making a train scene that doesn't feel identical to a train scene that's already been done in Mission Impossible and Mission Impossible 1.
Yeah.
And so it was a very unique way of doing it without duplicating.
Yeah.
That said, do you have any other pros that you would give this movie? Any other reasons why people should watch this movie?
Other than it sets up, this next movie. And I mean, ever since Rogue Nation, Rogue Nation was kind of the staple of how this next series and these movies were going to go. And this was a great example of how it's been just slowly, progressively, getting better.
Yeah. So I know, I would absolutely recommend. I think it's definitely not a perfect movie. I love it, but I'm also biased towards Mission Impossible. The exposition in certain scenes can be pretty bad. It can be pretty on the nose. But at the same time, I'm not going to fault Mission Impossible for its exposition because
that's not what it's known for.
Yeah, it's built so I've seen a lot of
Martin Scorsese doing this or something, who's known to have this amazing, beautiful dialogue.
Right.
Then okay.
So I've seen a lot of people online fault this and The Final Reckoning for bad exposition and bad use of plot devices. But I get it, but that's what Mission Impossible is. It's built around plot devices and exposition dumps.
It's also built around the plane and the train sequence, right? They're built around, it's an action movie.
Right. So even the TV show, right, back in the day, even the TV show was built on exposition dumps and plot devices. That's just what Mission Impossible is made of. You go there for the action sequences. You go there for the fun dynamics between the team. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going there because they're expecting, it's Scorsese dialogue. They're not.
Whatever it
is. And you shouldn't. So I get that it's a con. It's not a plus side of it, but it's an exposition dump meant to get you onto the next action scene. Yeah. So I get the reason behind it. My other con that I would give this movie is that And again, this might be because we're coming off of 4 movies where we had 3 of the best villains. Yeah, so, right, Mission Impossible 3, we had Owen Davian, played by Seymour Hoffman. Then we had Solomon Lane, and then we had John Lark.
Yeah.
All 3 of those villains were great.
We technically had, and then the one guy in 4, he was...
Kurt Hendricks wasn't that great of a villain, but he wasn't bad. Yeah. But those are 3 incredible villains, and I think that helps feed into the fact that I thought Gabriel in this movie was a pretty underwhelming villain.
Yeah, he just didn't really have any shining characteristics that... Yeah. I mean, a great example was John Lark or Solomon Lane, right? More Solomon Lane, right? He had this weird, creepy voice.
Which
he acted.
Part of it, too, goes to the actor. I don't think Isai Morales was that great of a choice for this character.
100%.
Because you look at, like, Philip Seymour Hoffman played Owen Davian incredibly well. And Sean Harris played Solomon Lane very creepily, but very intelligent.
He portrayed what that character would feel like.
And then do we even have to talk about Henry Cavill? Like, come on,
he's
that
a perfect
dude,
man.
He's a freaking walking meatloaf, and so he plays a very physically intimidating equal to Ethan, and it works out. And I think personally he's the best villain in Mission Impossible. And
that's also why I think Fallout is my favorite. I mean, granted, it is Henry Cavill, but
there's so many reasons why Fallout's great.
Anyway,
but
coming into this now, seeing
you have great villains leading up to that, and then Gabriel I think was just underwhelming. He just wasn't that interesting.
I think it's hard. I don't give him any credit, but I'm also not going to discredit it. He's kind of supposed to be just basically the spokesman of the entity.
Right.
Like the entity's really the horrible thing, which we of course learn more about.
Yeah.
And then he's just there to be like the voice of it. And I don't know, it just felt more like the villain is deaf and he's just there to like communicate to the audience.
Which I get a lot of people didn't like it, but I did like the way that the direction they took it with Final Reckoning in showing that the AI is actually the real villain of the movie. And Gabriel is still a villain. He's there because he wants to control the AI.
He was a bit more of a pawn.
Yeah, but he's just a pawn, really. Yeah. And so I know a lot of people didn't like that decision with Final Reckoning. I did. Yeah. So before we move on to Final Reckoning, any last thoughts on Dead Reckoning?
Honestly, I was really happy with Dead Reckoning, seeing it in theaters 2 years ago, and I was very excited for the next one to come out. I remember I was sitting in the theater, and I genuinely didn't know that it was a part 1, part 2 thing, and it ended, and I was fucking pissed, because I was like, what? Because then it said to be continued.
Well, it said end part 1.
Yeah, or whatever it was, and I didn't know that at the time because I didn't bother to pay attention. I don't know why. Maybe I was in an altered state.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely doesn't end on a big cliffhanger, but it does end on a cliffhanger in the sense that Ethan gets both halves of the key. Right?
And now it's like, hey, what's next?
Yep. Right. And then he ends up going off. He's still on the run. Mm-hmm. So with that, let's just before we get there, give you a brief reminding of how our scale goes. As a 1-star movie, I have Argyle. I think the movie was terrible. As a 5-star, I have Tomorrow Never Dies, and as a 10-star, I have Top Gun Maverick. Yeah. Just so you can get an idea of what I like.
I still haven't updated mine.
You haven't. So tell us very briefly about yours.
My new one that I would say, because we talked about this, would be The Flash.
It's a terrible
movie. The Flash was horrible.
I agree, 100%.
My five would be The Rise of Skywalker.
Yikes, that's a generous rating for Rise of Skywalker.
I really liked the end of it. Because then I felt like I could finally rest in peace. And I was like, hey,
interesting.
We're good. We're done.
Let's not talk about Rise of Skywalker anymore. No more.
That's fair. And then a 10 for me, just because I rewatched it recently, was No Country for Old Men. I think that movie was phenomenal.
So with that said, let's talk about our ratings. So I gave this movie a 9. Again, I'm biased towards Mission Impossible. I love Mission Impossible. And so I think it's a great movie. And
I was still pretty close.
Yeah, you were close. You had an 8.5.
I still really enjoyed this movie. I mean, we talk about this, but I do nitpick a little bit more when it's something that I don't love, and it's vice versa, right? If it's something you love, you're not going to nitpick it as much.
You want me to really get into Star Wars?
That's what I'm saying. Like, I would just sit there and be like, okay, great. I still love it.
We have our biases. I get that. Yeah. I get that. Anyway. So, all that said, let's talk about Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, my number 1 most anticipated movie of the year. Which,
overall, it was a really fun watch.
I was gonna say, It's too bad we had to make this episode a two-parter because we don't have any more time to talk about Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. But that said, let's talk about it. So Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning was originally titled Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 2, which it still is a Part 2.
Yeah, I mean, but it kind of discloses that in the movie where it doesn't really take place too much further after that. It kind of still feels
like to think of this, the very good comparison to this is Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Those two movies are very different from each other, but they are still part of the same story, and you can tell they're part of the same story. And so, yes, Infinity War ends on a much bigger cliffhanger than Dead Reckoning. But
yes,
still, though, I think just tonally between the two movies,
the comparison.
Infinity War is a lot faster paced movie. It's a lot more.
There's a lot more in depth.
Yeah, it's a lot more like you don't really know what's going to happen, and then it happens.
Yeah.
Whereas Endgame it's a lot slower movie. It's longer, but it also is building up towards a much bigger grand finale. And so I feel like that could be said the same for the Final Reckoning and Dead Reckoning. Is the Final Reckoning is a slower paced movie. I still think the pacing works, but it doesn't have as much action. And it's building up towards something a lot bigger.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit more on the dialogue side of things in this than it is in some of the other ones.
So if you haven't seen Final Reckoning yet, this is your final spoiler that you're going to get, your final spoiler warning. But the plot takes place 2 months after Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning.
It 2? I thought it was I thought he said it was like it's been 30
months.
days.
Yeah, just 2 months.
Anyway,
and so
it's pretty quick.
It follows Ethan, who now has both halves of the cruciform key, and his goal is to try and find the sunken Russian submarine to get the entity's source code and destroy it.
Yeah,
and so that's where the plot takes you. So let's start off with our. Go ahead.
Our pros.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just the feeling of it, right? Like walking into the movie of just kind of knowing and feeling that joy of being like, hey, this is kind of where it all, comes to the end, right? That's why it's called The Final Reckoning.
Yeah, I do think that's one of the reasons they retitled it, is to market it more as this is the last Mission Impossible. I don't know that it will be because, come on, it's Hollywood.
There's been a lot of interviews that he's
capitalize
said that he's been open to, of course, doing more in the future. Like, who knows if it's a new team. Long story short, I thought that it was just a really good feeling of kind of going in to be like, this is really where it's going to come to end, and knowing that it has to really almost end on some type of a happy note to an extent, right?
I got to say, the anticipation for me for this movie was off the charts. I was so excited for this movie.
I know you were a lot more excited.
At the same time, I was also not going into this movie expecting it to be Mission Impossible Fallout, because quite frankly, that movie's perfect to me, and I don't think they've ever topped that. And I don't think they did top it, but I do think it was a great movie, and I'll get into why.
Yeah.
But so I guess just to start off as kind of some of my pros for this movie, walking into this movie, I didn't know what the stakes were going to be, but very early on in the movie, Ethan has a direct confrontation with the entity. He goes into, at the end of Dead Reckoning, we see Gabriel inside of some kind of chamber, kind of a coffin chamber thing that he's talking to the entity, kind of how he gets his knowledge. Ethan goes into that same thing and he talks directly to the entity. And what I think is really cool is that's essentially how Ethan gets his mission briefing, right? Because normally he gets a mission briefing from someone else.
Well, we kind of got a little bit from the president.
We kind of did. We get kind of an exposition dump from the president as far as the state of the world goes.
Yeah, and she's like, your mission is to come in, be done.
She didn't even really say that. She just said, come home, Ethan. And so I thought that was interesting. Basically. But then when I rewatched it and I watched when he talks to the entity, that's how the entity starts. He's like, good evening, Mr. Hunt. And instead of giving him the choice to accept the mission, he says, you will do this, or the fate of the entire world rests in your hands. And that's where you get into the stakes. I love the stakes of this movie because during this confrontation, Ethan discovers what the stakes are, which is that the entity has started to gain control of all the different nuclear arsenals throughout the world. And his plan is to essentially launch a global nuclear Armageddon. Right? So as far as stakes are concerned, you can't get any higher. Like, these are the highest stakes can be, because it's literally about the destruction of the entire planet, with the exception of a few of the entity's followers who would rebuild Earth, essentially. Yeah. Because that's something they touch on briefly, and you see it throughout the movie, is that there are followers of the entity, people who essentially worship it, want it to continue. Yeah. And so you see two people in particular that have an effect on the plot that are part of that cult. but the movie, it's the entity's plan, right? Is cause global nuclear Armageddon and then rebuild the Earth with a few of its followers, essentially thinking itself as God.
Yeah.
So that is one of my pros. Is I loved just the whole movie felt very kind of gloomy. Like it didn't have the fun kind of feel.
The color scheme, I will agree, but that it was meant to be like
that,
and
right? So the whole feel, it does not feel like Dead Reckoning. It doesn't feel like Ghost Protocol, or even Fallout or Rogue Nation for that matter. There are a lot more fun movies, and they do a better job of balancing humor and action. But this movie is a lot more like, wow, there's a finality here that literally the world can end. So there's this overall gloom that comes over this movie that I really liked because it's different, very different from other Mission Impossibles.
Yeah, it is.
But it helped me, especially when he's shown kind of this nuclear war. It helped me realize like the stakes they were going for. So, so there's just one of my pros. But Evan, give me some of yours.
I mean, there's a lot. Clearly, the stunt work is always fun. I didn't mind the score. I thought the score wasn't bad. We got a little bit of kind of the new aspect to it. I think the submarine scene was beyond amazing to me. Like seeing a lot of the behind the scenes stuff of how they had to do that submarine scene. That's definitely one of my highlights.
What I will say is if anybody's going to go see this movie, absolutely see it in an IMAX theater. It's 100% worth it. It feels huge, and especially that submarine scene. So this movie
scene's awesome, dude.
Very different from Dead Reckoning
very much
in the story structure of it because it jumps around a little bit at the start. Stays mostly in London, but there's a lot that happens there, right? Ethan talks to the entity, kind of gets his mission briefing from the entity. And then, spoiler alert, Luther is killed by Gabriel.
What?
No. Because Luther, throughout this 2-month period,
has been working to build the poison key.
The poison pill is what he calls it, right? Because the end of Dead Reckoning, he said says he has to go somewhere where the entity can't find him. And he builds this poison pill, which when it's matched up with the entity's source code that's in the Sevastopol, the submarine.
It's supposed to basically
it'll essentially, it's a virus, essentially.
Yeah.
And so Gabriel takes the poison pill from Luther and then kills him, essentially. He puts this bomb where Luther's locked up.
Yeah.
And Ethan has to go and chase down Luther or Gabriel. So structurally, it's very different from Dead Reckoning, but I liked the pacing of it because I felt like it was building up towards something a lot bigger, which ultimately it was with the submarine sequence
the finale
and the airplane sequence.
Yeah.
So tell me your thoughts on the submarine sequence.
It was a great example of number one, like infrastructure and scenery, right? Like just the actual set itself. Seeing how they, kind of built it and organized it. But it was a great representation of when he was trying to escape after he found the source code. Right? He just has to kind of just think on his feet. He's like, oh, I can't fit through here. Maybe I've got to lose some of my gear. I've got to freeze for a little bit, right? And it was just that kind of classic Mission Impossible of him just thinking on his feet, and then he kind of gets sucked down. But then he's like, you know what? I believe that I'll be found, blah, blah, blah. So then he just basically floats, etc. And that was a great representation of us seeing that's what Mission Impossible is, right? He's just supposed to be able to think on his feet and be ready for really almost any outcome. They kind of planned a little bit of it where they were almost a little prepared for him too, right? That was kind of the whole plan.
Right.
Which I also love because that's another part of Mission Impossible, right? How whenever you kind of get to this realization of the solution, you kind of realize that it was actually part of the plan, right? They were setting small things up to make sure that that solution was going to happen. Anyway, I thought that the submarine scene was just really, really well done.
The submarine sequence is very well shot and directed, not only because it used a huge set piece.
It was huge.
They built a massive submarine set piece for it, and the way that they rotated it, because the submarine's rolling, right? So the idea is, the submarine in the movies at the bottom or close, it's on
It's on the sea floor of site.
Yeah, kind of like a sea cliff. And so it's like 500 feet below the sea. But because the submarine sunk, there are certain parts of the submarine that still are not filled with water.
Mm-hmm.
So
and then the water starts to get in.
So the water pressure changes when Ethan comes in, and so that causes the submarine to roll, which I think makes a lot of sense. Instead of, I feel like an easy cop out. An easy cop out is just starts rolling, but it makes more sense that now that the water pressure within the submarine is changing, that would cause.
They made it more logical.
And the way it was directed, it was almost like a horror movie, right? He's going to explore this submarine, and it's very dark. The music's very gloomy. And then the sound design is incredible on that because there's so many different moving parts within the submarine that could kill Ethan, which, of course we know he's not going to die because it's only halfway through the movie, but it does really well in building the tension of what's going to happen. How is Ethan going to get out of this? And so I thought that the submarine scene was incredible.
I agree. I think it was
visually and just as a building tension. Another great sequence that I really liked is towards the beginning of the movie. I consider it peak Mission Impossible. So early in the movie, Gabriel captures Grace and Ethan, and we get an exposition dump, right? Mm-hmm. But the way that Ethan breaks out of his capture is he chews on a fake cyanide pill.
And then they have to pretend to save him.
And then they have to, because they need him because he has the key in order to get to the Sevastopol to get the source code so that Gabriel can control the entity.
Yeah.
So Gabriel needs him alive, but Ethan bites on a fake cyanide pill. And then when they're going to revive him, he does freaking awesome Ethan Hunt stuff. It does the Mission Impossible theme. It's so freaking cool. That sequence is so good. And then I like how they added a little bit of humor into it by having Ethan go a little bit over the top, but it's shown off scene because it's a PG-13 movie.
Yeah.
And then that leads you into your opening credits. Mm-hmm. I think overall, one of the things I really liked about the movie is that it had a very Cold War type of feel to it.
Yeah, you've mentioned that a few times. It's one of your favorite things.
It is. And so,
it's kind of supposed to be,
it's very
right?
different
it's
from
this end of life, end of world type of situation that they have to.
I liked it because it kind of gets you back to like a 60s, 70s spy movie where that was the thing.
Well, because most of it feels like it's the U.S. versus the Russians because we eventually learned, right, they've got to go into Russian waters. The Russians actually go in and invade their little outpost, right? So it kind of feels already like there is this world war that's already going on.
It has the DNA of a Cold War movie that if anybody makes the wrong move, nuclear war could start and wipe out everybody.
Yeah.
And then you have the added threat of that everybody knows that the clock is ticking because the entity is already getting access to everyone's nuclear arsenals.
Yeah.
So I really liked that they went with that approach, and that's the reason why it does feel like a slower movie. I still think the pacing works. Mm-hmm. But this is a long movie. It's 2 hours and 49 minutes. I still don't think you feel it because I think it's well shot and edited. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have as much action because it is building towards this grand finale.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more of the dialogue to get to them basically getting to South Africa. Mm-hmm. And then that entire final sequence.
Let's talk about the plane sequence.
I really love the plane sequence. The way that it was shot and made was really difficult. And for a lot of it, Ethan or Tom Cruise wasn't wearing a parachute. And the dude's like 10, 15,000 feet in the air.
Right. You got like it.
They have like his suspension.
You just have the suspension cable that he's attached to.
But it was funny because I heard some behind the scenes of it was Simon Pegg and Haley Atwell in like an interview. They're like talking about how they were basically on the ground just hearing how it was going over the walkie-talkie. And there were one or two scenes where he slipped, and they're like, if he slips and a diver can't go get him with a parachute in time, he is genuinely dead.
It's wild. It's wild.
So respect to him regardless.
So what I love is that, again, there's not as much action in this movie, but I think it's the story carries it enough to get there. But when you get to the South African scene, right, because by the end of the movie, the whole Ethan's mission from the entity, which is separate from his own mission, but the entity essentially tells him, you're going to bring me to this South African bunker that's built essentially for an end of the world doomsday kind of scenario so that the entity can survive when it decides to launch all the nukes.
Yeah.
And so that's essentially what the entity tells him. And then Ethan has a separate idea to recover the source code from the Sevastopol, upload it to the poison pill that Luther made, and then trick the entity into going there so they can capture it, essentially in another device that Luther created, which is like
then kill it.
It's like a flash drive, essentially. Right?
That's basically what they call it, but they called it a 5D flash drive.
Yeah, it's essentially a flash drive that they're going to upload the entity on, because that's how it works, right? It's code. It has to be housed somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I like that, maybe because I work with computers a little bit more, and so
it felt a bit more reasonable.
Yeah, it made sense.
Then let's just kill it.
Right, it made perfect sense to me because it's code. You can't kill it. So what do? You trick it into going onto a server somewhere, because it has to be on a server in order for it to.
And then you have to take it, and then boom.
Yeah, and so I really like that idea. That. That's how they end.
It felt a bit more on the logical side that you could relate to, which I did enjoy. I thought that was smart.
And so I liked it. It's building up towards that. They finally get to the South African bunker, and then Gabriel, who by this time he's not really part of the entity anymore. The entity has cast him out. The entity now wants Ethan to do his work. But Gabriel still wants to control it and essentially make himself the god of the world. And so he threatens to blow up the bunker, which would destroy both of their plans, because destroy Ethan's plan by tricking the entity into there, but it also destroy the entity's plan to
survive and everything.
And so that's where kind of Gabriel gains that upper hand, and then you get this really cool action sequence inside the bunker, where Ethan's trying to chase down Gabriel, which leads into the biplane chase. So again, there's a lot of moving parts towards the end of this, because you have Ethan trying to chase down Gabriel, who has the poison pill,
and then
accomplish that mission.
It's Paris, Grace, and Benji working to
establish,
break into the server and everything.
Break into the server, and
then so we've got Dega and the other two working on saving the bomb and everything.
And then on the other, back in the U.S., you have because the entity Rise is gaining control of all these different nuclear arsenals. The U.S. is struggling with the idea of, should we just launch our nukes against them so they can't do it to us first?
Yeah.
And so you have kind of this really tense sequence where you have the president and her cabinet, essentially, who are deciding, okay, are we going to launch our nukes so that they don't attack us first, or so the entity doesn't attack us
first? Or do we
first?
Sacrifice one city so that way we can still have the rest of the U.S. to basically save
and I also like that. So the idea is we're going to launch our nukes to destroy all them, but we also are going to sacrifice one of our own cities just to show that we're more trying to kill the entity than we are trying to start a nuclear war.
Yeah.
And so it makes for an intense situation. I think is really well done.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely brings that post-apocalyptic vibe to the story of how it's supposed to be looking and what the outcome.
But then that's all happening while Ethan's on the airplane, and you get the really epic chase on the biplanes that the movie's really been building up towards. And I gotta say, I don't think it disappoints. I think it's a great scene. I think it's everything that it was marketed to be. That said, I don't think it reaches the heights of Fallout's helicopter
Definitely
chase.
Does not.
Because, I mean, you can't really top that. That's like the coolest action sequence ever made. But I still think it's incredible. Visually, it looks incredible.
Yeah. Because
you have this yellow and this red biplane flying over this very green South African landscape. And so visually, it looks incredible. And then you get to Gabriel's death, which I think is a little corny.
I 100% agree.
So
that's my biggest con off the bat.
I think that is one of my cons.
Boom.
Exactly.
It's just, I mean, granted, he wasn't really unintimidating.
Yeah, I don't think he was a great villain in the first place.
But just the fact of how he died.
He dies in a very cheesy way, where his head essentially splits against the
back
biplane.
of the biplane, and he just flies away.
It was cheesy. It felt out of place, but at the same time, it was very. Spy movies are usually built around very over-the-top villains, like you look at any Bond villain.
Yep.
So it doesn't bother me as much as it otherwise would. But
I still thought it was very poor.
It is still pretty cheesy.
Especially since it's the final movie, right? They couldn't have made it a lot more intricate of Ethan beating him or in a big explosion, right? They could have done a little bit more to make that more intense.
I will say one thing I absolutely love is when he breaks his arm. So when he's on the plane and he
hits down.
He grabs his Gabriel's arm and just pulls it back,
and then he just flies out through the wind. And he's just
I love that scene.
I thought that was really unique.
It was very. It was like hell yeah, you know. So, with that, any other pros that you would mention for this movie? Any other reasons why you would tell people to go and see this movie?
It's the finale. They end it as a really great story, and it's a great way to. I think that they still wrapped it up really well, and I still give them a lot of credit, right, because of how much was happening and how much ground they had to cover, and still making the story wrap up and be pretty clean for the most part. So I'll give them a lot of credit there because there was a lot that they had to cover, a lot. But honestly, it's a great way to finish out the Mission Impossible series, and who knows, you know, what they'll do in the future.
I mean, I'm sure eventually they'll come around to making Mission Impossible 8, but who knows?
Whatever it is.
Who knows?
Yeah.
So then let's talk about some of your cons.
Gabriel's death, right? What's his name that got reintroduced? The guy from the Black Vault in Mission Impossible 1.
Oh, William Donlow. So,
Sorry,
yeah,
Donlow.
they bring him back from Mission Impossible.
I think number 1, they gave him a cool cameo at first, which I was like, oh, right. Everybody is the nostalgia of it that everybody's like, oh, I remember him from the first one, right? And then we hear about the rabbit's foot. Like hearing about all this nostalgia and stuff was kind of cool because then we understand how all the stories.
I just gotta say, I called the rabbit's foot thing on our podcast.
Yeah, and I
go back to
say
the
anything.
episodes before. I called.
Yeah.
Right, so they reveal in this movie that the rabbit's foot was in fact an earlier version of the entity. So
yeah,
I saw it coming in it. Look, it makes sense in not only. It does. I don't think it's just a shoehorn in this movie because if you go back to previous movies, first off in Dead Reckoning, they say that an agent stole whatever it was, and that's where the U.S. got it from. So there's that. But then Mission Impossible 3, so many people are complaining that, oh, it was a bioweapon, except it was never said to be a bioweapon ever in Mission Impossible 3.
It shows
like it shows a biohazard canister. But when Benji describes what he thinks the rabbit foot is, he says world-ending technology.
Yeah.
And so you can't be complaining, internet people, that they shoehorned that in because Mission Impossible 3, the way they describe the rabbit foot when they talk about it, it's more likely that it is the entity world-ending technology than it ever is the bioweapon that it's claimed to be by the internet people, because it's never said to be that in Mission Impossible 3.
Which I think is kind of fun that they just kind of left it there, right? For us to almost guess and just wait for.
And no, I'm not saying that they were trying to, in Mission all the way back in 2006, they were saying, oh, this is going to be the entity in 20 years when Mission Impossible 8 releases.
Yeah.
That's definitely not what they were planning, but they were not intending it to be a bioweapon because they just did that in Mission Impossible 2. That's why they left it vague, and that's also why they had that explanation by Benji saying, oh, I think it's world-ending technology or the anti-god.
Yep.
Anyway, back to the comments.
I don't really like how he became kind of part of the team, Don Lowe.
I think it makes sense because
I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense. I don't know. Just this reintroduction of the character was already kind of like, you know, a fun cameo. And for me, I did nitpick it a little bit more, whatever.
But again, his introduction makes sense though, because right, you've already established in Dead Reckoning that this sub crashed somewhere in the Bering Sea. And then all the way back in Mission Impossible 1, he said after he allows the Black Vault break-in to happen that they were shipping him off up to a Mana radar tower in Alaska.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to bring back a character there instead of just nostalgia. It makes sense in context of the story to do that.
Which I think is smart, but I don't like how him and his wife follow them all the way to South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, the wife, yes, I think makes less sense, but the way Benji talks about Don Lowe saying he's an intelligent, or he's one of the most famous coders. It makes sense they'd bring him along to destroy something that's literally code.
Yeah, but I don't know. I just don't think he was very necessary to the story in general.
Yeah, I could see why you could get rid of him.
And he was just like, you could have just given him the cameo, and sadly he could have died in the fire, right? And sacrificed himself.
We don't kill people in Mission Impossible except Luther and Elsa. And
the two random people that Ethan decided to kill.
And the two people Ethan decided to kill.
Which I don't feel like is very Mission Impossible-esque.
I love that. I think it was so fun. because
I disagree strongly.
Because it was a fun comedic element to bring into the movie. Because I
strongly disagree with that. That's one of my other cons. That scene, I was not a huge fan of. Dialogue wise, the tooth was great and everything, but there's the specific scene of dialogue that I've told you about. And it's Ethan talking to Grace, and then he turns away, and then he talks to her again. And it happens like 4 times, and it got repetitive after the 3rd time that I was like, okay.
I don't think it happens 4 times, but I'm going to let you believe that.
I think it happens 3 or 4. It happens too many times to happen.
I don't even know what you're talking about right now.
She's standing there, right, watching everything like happen, and then the camera starts to zoom out a little bit, and then he goes, "Come on, Grace, we need to go." And then he starts to like move, and then he comes back. "Oh, you didn't think that I would never let them hurt you. Come on, we need to go."
Because
and then he turns and
that
does
was
it
a
again.
very Mission Impossible comedic element.
But
like
he does it too many times, and I think that it was too over the top trying to be funny.
I loved it. So, I mean, we can go down to personal preference, but you go and you watch the humor in Rogue Nation and Ghost Protocol, it's very in line with that. And so it makes perfect sense.
Anyway, I'm not a huge fan of that scene. And Gabriel's death. I was so beyond disappointed when I saw that. I was like,
yeah, no, I did. They definitely.
They also added some weird random plot points, like whatever his name was Jim Phelps' son. Like, no, but again, yes, I know
that's something that was set up in Dead Reckoning.
Yeah, but it was just so random that like
it wasn't, because I mean the very first time Briggs is introduced in Dead Reckoning is when he's on the plane coming to Abu Dhabi to chase after Ethan. Degas asks him, "Is this is it personal? Do you know him personally?" And then he says, "No, I don't know him personally." But then Degas is like, "But it is personal." And so they set it right from the beginning, and that's why Briggs is so apt to try and capture Ethan, is because he clearly has some kind of issue with him. It's kind of funny though, because in Dead Reckoning he does a lot of like where he's still kind of on the fence, but there was a few scenes where he was really nice and still was like a human with him and didn't like, go over the top. He basically almost let him live twice when he probably should have technically killed him. Number 1 on the train when him and Degas. Yeah.
And then they let Gabriel go, and he was supposed to, try and apprehend him. And then they're like, "We need to stop the train. You got to listen to me." And then he takes
Ethan, but then ultimately he still ends up going to try and capture Ethan, which is why Ethan has to jump off the train.
The point is I don't know. I'm not a huge fan. I really like the actor. But
I mean, again, I
just don't like how in the second one
they had already set it up for that, and so I like that they.
I don't like how in the second one they tried to make him seem like such a bad person, like, and how he really hated.
They did. I think it made sense now that you can understand in Dead Reckoning why he didn't really like Ethan, because of a personal history with him, which that was explained.
Yeah,
is actually because Ethan killed his dad.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
So. I get why people might not like that, but again, it's something that was set up and they had been building to. I think people just forgotten a little bit.
Yeah. But other than that, those are my basic cons. Honestly, I really enjoyed the movie.
I mean, I
walked out both times and I was still pretty happy.
I do think that editing wise, this wasn't as sharply edited as previous Mission Impossible, so that's definitely one of my bigger cons. They used a lot of flashbacks, which I get using flashbacks, but I think they used them too much at times.
They relied a lot on, hey, this is what happened, and then they used a lot of that through the story.
Which I think part of it too was to try and introduce a story that people could watch having never seen Dead Reckoning.
Which I feel like they shouldn't have done.
They shouldn't have done, but that's more of I think probably coming from a studio saying because Dead Reckoning didn't make that much money. It made good money, but
they probably wanted to make it feel like somebody could just walk in and watch it and kind of catch up and understand it, which I think is poor. I would prefer that they would have taken all of that out. People care about the trilogy and the series and the franchise, and actually just go through and watch the damn movies instead of, let me start at episode 5. Oh, well, what's going on? Like, I think that's stupid, but I can't control what they do. It's the damn studios.
It is what it is. Yeah. So I do think they used too many flashbacks. I think that the exposition in this movie was handled better than in Dead Reckoning. Yes, there is more dialogue in this movie. It's more plot driven, but the exposition that does happen is not as robotic as in Dead Reckoning. And so I appreciated that more. Even though, like, again, I'm not going to fault a Mission Impossible movie for exposition. Since the 60s, it's been built on just dumping all your exposition out, then having your plot happen.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to fault a movie for that, for at least the Mission Impossible movie.
Yeah.
Because it's DNA.
I mean, they're supposed to be built around these action and intense stunt scenes. Like, that's what they're known for.
They're built around, I mean, at least towards in the movie, they're built a lot more around those action sequences, but even in the TV show, they're built towards espionage sequences. But it requires
spy.
It just requires dumping all the exposition out.
So people are like, okay, great, we get the story.
Which I think again is one of the reasons why 4, 5, and 6 work so well with their pacing, is because they just dump all the exposition out, and then the audience knows exactly what's supposed to happen. But then obviously there's objects that come up that kind of intervene on that.
Yeah.
So it makes sense. That's, I think, one of my biggest cons. Other than that, I love the movie. And
I still was very happy walking out of it.
I've seen it several times now. I absolutely love, probably my favorite thing is just the whole, nuclear war, world ending thing, to where
I thought the color grading was very well done
to reflect that,
because it follows along that scale of being that Cold War type, that the color grading and the color.
And so I really like that because it's just upping the scales. And again, like, you want to criticize Mission Impossible, you can go watch Ghost Protocol, Fallout, and Final Reckoning. They all essentially have the same final ending sequence where they're very similar. Ethan on some kind of moving vehicle chasing after a bad guy who has one half of a piece that's going to stop a nuclear bomb, while the rest of his team is focusing on doing the other half that's going to stop the nuclear bomb. Yeah, they all are the same movie
in some type of
different
degree.
Ways, and so you can, like, you're going to criticize Mission Impossible, you can do that, but it is what it is, and I love it. So again, that's my bias. That's my personal bias. So I'm not going to complain. With all that said, let's give this movie a rating. So
I was definitely lower.
I gave this movie a higher rating than you did.
I know for a fact.
I have this movie sitting at a 9. At the same point, I've given 4, 5, 7, all 9s, because that's Mission Impossible. I love it. So what can I say?
I gave it a 7. I kind of disclose. I mean, we didn't know why.
Yeah, but
I still don't hate it. Right, like a 7 still really, like, I still go watch it again. Like, I'm not gonna go drag myself.
I can understand why people didn't like this movie, but I personally
agree with that.
I love it. So.
I think people that tried and give it like less than a 6 were kind of stupid. Like, that just. There's a threshold that I have.
What I will say
in good movies that I'm like, well.
What I will say is that absolutely everybody should go see this movie in the theater, because it's a movie to keep the theater industry alive. It's a movie that was made for a big screen.
I mean, also Tom Cruise has said 1,000 times that all he's ever wanted to do was to keep the movie industry alive.
Yeah, exactly. So if there's anybody in Hollywood I do want to support with my money, it's Tom Cruise, because of the extremes he goes to make fun experiences for an audience.
The man is literally risking his life to then say, hey, audience, hey, people of the world, here's an enjoyable movie, go watch it.
Right. I mean, just look at his last 4 movies, right? His last 4 movies that he released was
Helicopter,
Fallout,
on a train,
Top Gun Maverick,
jumped off of a fucking cliff.
Yeah, so that's my thing. So his last 4 movies that he's released have been
crazy.
Again, Fallout, where he was piloting a helicopter, he was doing all these crazy things. Top Gun Maverick, where he put himself into a jet to.
Yeah, I thought we were talking about more Mission Impossible stuff, but yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but even then, so his last 4 movies have been Fallout, Top Gun Maverick, Dead Reckoning, Final Reckoning. Just look at the things he's done. The literally things he's put his body through just for our entertainment.
Just to say, hey, here's a movie that I think is really good. I hope you enjoy it.
That's the kind of person that you want to go give your money to, because he's literally risking life and limb for our entertainment. Yeah. And so
eventually he probably won't be able to get as crazy as he is now.
I don't know. He might not even be human. Who knows? But
he is the entity.
He is the entity. Oh. But there you go. There you have it. There's our thoughts on Mission Impossible, The Final Reckoning, and Dead Reckoning.
Go see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's great.
I would recommend seeing it. I would recommend seeing it on the biggest screen you can find with the loudest sound.
That's what it's built for.
Especially that submarine sequence.
The submarine, I enjoyed watching the submarine more.
Make sure you are watching that in a theater with very good sound, because the sound design in that submarine scene is incredible. That said, let us know your thoughts in the comments, what you thought about Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. Have you seen it?
Franchise ended.
And actually, you should drop your ratings too. Drop your ratings on how you would rank all 8 movies, and we'll have to do that one of these days. We'll have to rank all 8 Mission movies.
I mean, we technically have.
It's true. Go back and rewatch all of our reviews if you haven't. Yeah. That said, thanks for watching. Spoiler alert, and we'll catch you next time.